broadcast was already electric, but this moment crackled with something more, a collision of ego and grace unfolding in real time. Under the unforgiving glare of studio lights, Kellyanne Conway leaned forward, voice sharp and cutting, slicing through the panel like a storm front. Each word was a jab, deliberate, forceful, designed to rattle. Anchors exchanged quick, uneasy glances. One reached instinctively for their notes, as if paper could shield them from the tension. The cameras caught every flicker of irritation, every tightened jaw, and the viewers at home could feel it, a sense that something was about to break. Across from her, Repsors Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. No raised eyebrow, no clenched fist, no rush to fill the space with noise. She sat anchored, hands folded, a calm center in the eye of Conway's storm. It was the kind of composure that unsettles opponents more than any shouted rebuttal could. Conway's pitch rose. Crockett's stillness only grew heavier, more deliberate, as though she were letting every barb hang in the air, turn stale, and fall harmlessly to the floor. The contrast was magnetic. One voice trying to dominate the room, the other quietly owning it, without a single wasted breath. The audience didn't yet know it, but they were watching a masterclass in restraint, and restraint was about to become power. Social media was already ahead of the curve. Phones lit up like fireworks as viewers clipped the exchange, flooding. Timelines with captions that wrote themselves, "This is how you handle chaos." Hashtags began to spark and multiply. Edits with bold subtitles hit TikTok before the debate was even halfway done. Each clip seemed to make the same silent promise. Something big was coming. The anchors tried to steer the conversation, but Conway pressed harder, mistaking volume for victory, mistaking Crockett's quiet for weakness. What she couldn't see, but millions watching could, was that silence, in the right hands, is louder than any shout. Then Conway leaned in, ready to land what she thought was the finishing blow. It was the moment she believed would seal the segment, humiliate her opponent, and remind viewers why she'd built a career on confrontation. But she was wrong, because what happened next didn't just steal the air from the room. It would send shockwaves far beyond it. And Kellyanne Conway was the last person to see it coming. The segment wasn't meant to be explosive. It was scheduled as another panel discussion on primetime cable, a predictable mix of talking heads dissecting the week's political storms. But America in that moment was a country on edge, partisan lines drawn like trenches, culture wars spilling into every corner of life, and every word carrying more weight than it used to. When the cameras came on, it was supposed to be about policy, about the headlines of the day. But in truth, it was about something deeper. Who gets to speak? Who gets to be heard? And whose dignity gets trampled along the way? Kellyanne Conway came prepared to dominate. For years, she had thrived in this environment, quick, combative, sharp-tongued, and always ready with a counterpunch. Her style was volume and velocity, and it had served her well. That night, the topic was messy enough to give her room to attack. Debates over voting rights, representation, and the shifting landscape of American identity. These were issues that cut deep, issues that stirred anger and pride in equal measure. To Conway, this was her arena, her comfort zone. She was ready to frame the discussion as a battle of wills, and she knew exactly how to rile an audience. But the producers hadn't booked just anyone across the table from her. They had brought in Repsors Jasmine Crockett, a rising figure known for her clarity and grit. She was an attorney by trade, an advocate by calling, and one of the new faces of unapologetic representation in American politics. For many watching, she symbolized a quiet but steady shift. the idea that politics could be as much about service and dignity as it was about spectacle. And that night, she was not just there to defend policy points. She was there, unknowingly, to become a symbol of something bigger. Conway could sense it from the start, the way the anchors turned to Crockett for perspective, the way the camera lingered just a second longer on her calm face. These things mattered on television. It wasn't just a debate. It was narrative, and Conway knew when she wasn't the center of it. That awareness hardened her tone, sharpened her edges. She interrupted more, leaned forward more, punctuating sentences with pointed glances as if to reclaim control. Crockett, on the other hand, was unshaken. She listened, responded briefly, and refused to match Conway's tempo. And it was this composure, this refusal to play the same game, that began to tilt the room. Viewers noticed, social media noticed, and crucially, Conway noticed. To an audience living in a polarized America, it was no longer just two women on a panel. It was a mirror of the larger struggle outside the studio. Volume versus reason, chaos versus composure, old tactics versus new resolve. People watching at home weren't just evaluating arguments, they were watching identities clash, watching history tug against change. That's why the tension kept climbing. Conway couldn't afford to lose this moment. Crockett couldn't afford to break character, and the anchors, sensing something rare was unfolding, let the air stretch between questions, as if the silence itself was becoming part of the show. Long before this confrontation, Kellyanne Conway had carved out a place for herself in the political landscape, a place few could ignore and even fewer could match. She was not born into the spotlight. She built it. A strategist by instinct, she was quick, clever, and unafraid to turn friction into fuel. In the fast, unforgiving world of American politics, where hesitation often equals irrelevance, she was the one who ran toward the cameras while others hesitated in the wings. Her rise was not an accident. Conway understood something that many political operatives never quite grasp, that politics was theater, and that the stage had grown louder, faster, more visceral than ever before. Long before viral clips became currency, she mastered the arts of the soundbite, tight, sharp sentences designed to cut through noise and make headlines. She thrived on tension, seeing it not as risk, but as opportunity. Each televised interview was a chessboard, each opponent a piece to be moved, outflanked, or removed entirely. In the early days of her career, she was known for a rare mix of charisma and calculation. A pollster by training, she had a knack for reading moods, anticipating angles, and spinning chaos into clarity. Her success was fueled by loyalty to her candidates and an unflinching willingness to fight, even when the fight got ugly. She was the voice who could defend the indefensible, the one who could reframe a headline before it even hit the presses. But brilliance has its shadows. Alongside her triumphs came controversy. Conway's style was combative by nature, often blurring the line between strategy and spectacle. She could deliver biting sarcasm that thrilled her supporters and infuriated her critics. When cornered, she never softened. She sharpened. And in that sharpening, she sometimes cut too deep, leaving bruises not just on opponents, but on her own credibility. She had a gift for turning interviews into sparring matches, but sometimes the spectacle overshadowed the message. There were moments when that edge worked brilliantly. Viewers watched her parry hostile questions with a smirk, redirect conversations with startling agility, and stand unwavering in the face of panels stacked against her. It made her a figure impossible to ignore. But there were also cracks. Critics began to call out what they saw as evasions, exaggerations, and a reliance on volume over substance. The very tactics that made her famous also made her polarizing. And yet, Conway seemed to thrive in that tension. She understood that in an age of divided screens and shortened attention spans, polarization was not a weakness. It was a spotlight. As long as she was being talked about, she was winning. She knew how to dominate a narrative and how to make opponents lose their cool. More than once, her composure under fire had embarrassed seasoned hosts and rattled politicians. She was, master of controlled chaos, and chaos was her weapon. But every weapon has its limit, because for all her skill, her approach depended on a certain rhythm: provoke, dominate, disarm. It required opponents to play the same game, to respond in kind, to meet fire with fire. What happens when the opponent refuses? What happens when someone decides not to swing back, but to stand still? To let the storm exhaust itself? That was the dynamic Conway had not fully prepared for that night. She wasn't facing a panelist who feared her interruptions, nor a politician desperate to match her speed. She was facing someone whose calmness wasn't weakness, but strategy. Someone who understood that sometimes silence is heavier than sound. And this is where the story shifted. Because dominance built on constant motion can stumble when the other side refuses to move. For Conway, that night would be a reminder that volume can demand attention, but it doesn't guarantee respect. She was about to learn that volume doesn't always win the argument. Before that night in the studio, before millions watched her hold her ground with quiet force, Jasmine Crockett's journey had already been marked by battles. Most of them fought far from the cameras. She was not born into privilege. Her story was forged in work, sacrifice, and a relentless belief in fairness. Raised in a world where she quickly learned that not all voices are heard equally, Crockett gravitated toward the law not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She saw injustice not as a concept, but as something close and personal. Families struggling, neighbors ignored, communities dismissed. For her, the courtroom was not a stage. It was a shield for those who didn't have one. Crockett's path was deliberate. She became an attorney with a reputation for doing the work few wanted, defending the underrepresented, challenging systems that often seemed immovable. Early in her career, she handled cases that taught her the value of preparation, patience, and precision. Each brief she filed, each argument she made, was a rehearsal for something larger, though she didn't know it yet. It wasn't about headlines. It was about principle. She built her credibility the hard way, one case, one client, one uphill climb at a time. But the courtroom wasn't her only battleground. Crockett's activism extended beyond the legal world, spilling into advocacy and public service. She knew that laws could protect people, but voices could move them. She marched, she organized, she stood in rooms where she was often the only woman of color, the only one speaking for those absent. There were times she was met with skepticism, times when she was underestimated or ignored. But each time, she learned. Silence is not surrender, and composure is not weakness. Her public service career grew from those lessons. When she ran for office, it wasn't because she wanted a title. It was because she understood that policy could change lives. Her campaign wasn't flashy, but it resonated. She spoke about equity, representation, and dignity. She talked about the people she served, not just the issues she fought. And slowly, she earned a following, not just voters, but believers. Along the way, there were defining moments. Facing tough opposition in legislative chambers, she refused to raise her voice even when others tried to drown her out. When confronted with hostility, she answered with facts. When baited, she didn't bite. It wasn't that she lacked fire, it was that she had learned to aim it. Those who worked with her often described her as calm under pressure and unshakable. But what they really meant was that she had seen enough storms to know when to stand still. Life had taught her resilience. She had endured personal challenges that could have broken her stride. Long hours away from loved ones, constant scrutiny, the weight of representing communities too often forgotten. And yet, each obstacle seemed to sharpen her resolve. To Crockett, every challenge was a test, every setback a lesson. She carried those lessons with her everywhere, into meetings, into hearings, and, eventually, into the national spotlight. By the time she walked onto that set opposite Kellyanne Conway, she had already lived the principle that would define her. Strength is not always loud, and authority is not always about control. Sometimes it's about knowing who you are when the room tries to shake you. She understood that real power can be quiet, steady, and unflinching. So when Conway raised her voice, Crockett didn't need to match it. She had spent years sharpening tools that were sharper than volume, clarity, poise, and a kind of courage that doesn't need permission to be heard. That night, she was not only a congresswoman, she was the sum of every client she defended, every march she joined, every door she opened for someone else. And this night, all that preparation would be tested live. It started like a simmer and grew into a boil. Conway had been in this arena too many times to sit back quietly. She thrived on control, and control for her meant motion, speaking faster, louder, more often than anyone else at the table. The discussion was supposed to be about policy, but in Conway's hands it became theater. She leaned in, voice firm, then sharp, cutting off Crockett mid-sentence, pivoting the conversation before the anchors could reclaim it. "You're ignoring the facts," Conway said, words clipped, a trace of impatience in every syllable. "You want to rewrite the rules, but you can't change reality." Her tone wasn't just assertive, it was an accusation, meant to put Crockett on the defensive, to corner her. It was a familiar move, one that often left her counterparts flustered or scrambling for footing. But Crockett didn't scramble. She didn't even flinch. Her hands stayed folded, her expression steady, eyes clear. She didn't rush to fill the silence when Conway paused. She let the words hang, and somehow they began to lose their weight. The anchors tried to intervene, sensing the rhythm of the show slipping. One cleared their throat, another gestured toward Crockett, but Conway pressed on. "You can't sit there and pretend," she said, voice rising, "that your side has the moral high ground. You talk about fairness, but what about accountability? What about truth?" It was the kind of barrage that could have rattled almost anyone. But Crockett's calm seemed to magnify the tension. The louder Conway became, the more her restraint stood out. The audience could feel it. Even through the screen, you could sense the shift. The energy wasn't just heated. It was uncomfortable, like a room where everyone knows something is about to snap. Social media was already stirring. Viewers clipped moments, posting captions like, "She's losing it," and "Look at Crockett, she's unshaken." Some praised Conway's fire, others mocked her intensity, but everyone agreed. This was no ordinary panel. The anchors now looked less like moderators and more like referees trying to keep pace. Their questions grew shorter, tighter, as though they were stepping back to avoid getting burned. One anchor finally turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, would you like to respond?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Crockett didn't rush. She glanced once at Conway, then back to the anchor. "I'll respond," she said softly, "but I'll do it when she's done." It was a simple sentence, but it landed with weight. The panel went quiet for a heartbeat, and in that quiet, Conway's voice seemed suddenly louder, almost too loud. Her frustration sharpened. Interruptions turned into mini-monologues. She gestured, leaned forward, pushed harder, as if trying to shake the calm out of the woman across from her. Crockett let it happen. She didn't match speed or tone. She simply waited, absorbing every word, letting the tension stretch until it was almost unbearable. And then, just when Conway seemed to sense that her points weren't landing the way they used to, she tried a different tactic. She decided to make it personal. And then came the question Conway shouldn't have asked. There was a beat of silence after Conway's last question, a silence so thick that even the anchors didn't dare cut through it. It wasn't just an awkward pause. It was a pause that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Jasmine Crockett leaned back slightly, letting the energy in the room settle into something almost uncomfortable. Her calmness was unnerving, her restraint deliberate. The cameras caught her face in perfect stillness. No smile, no smirk, no sign of irritation, just a quiet, steady gaze, as if she were looking through the noise and choosing her words carefully. Then she spoke, and her voice was soft. Not weak. Soft, measured, deliberate. "Are you done?" she asked Conway. Not with sarcasm, but with an almost disarming courtesy. Conway blinked, perhaps caught off guard by the politeness. "Because, if you are, I'd like to answer." It was such a simple sentence, but it flipped the room. The anchors leaned forward. The audience watching at home straightened up. And somewhere, on screens across the country, someone pressed record. Crockett began slowly, each word like a stone placed firmly on the table. "I was raised to believe that if you have something worth saying, you don't need to shout to say it. You listen first. You think. And when you finally speak, you make it count. So let me answer your question, since you asked about truth." Her tone never rose, but the weight of her words grew heavier with each sentence. "You accuse my side of ignoring facts, but the truth is this. We are here because people like me, people from communities you've dismissed, fought to even have a seat at this table. We are here because we believe this country can be better than its loudest voices. And I won't be shouted down just because you think volume equals victory." Conway tried to interject, but Crockett held up a hand, not angrily, but firmly, like a teacher quieting a room. "You've had your turn," she said, still calm. "Now it's mine." The panel went still. What followed was a kind of precision that only comes from years of preparation. Crockett answered every point Conway had thrown at her, not with anger, but with clarity. She dismantled the accusations one by one, connecting them to larger truths, about representation, about dignity, about why shouting doesn't make an argument stronger. She reminded the audience of her own background, not as a weapon, but as proof. "I know what it means to fight for fairness, because I've done it when no one was watching, when there were no cameras, when it was just me and someone who needed help. That's why I sit here today. Not to win a soundbite, but to stand for something bigger than either of us." The anchors couldn't hide their surprise. One of them muttered a quiet, "Wow," barely audible but caught by the microphones. Social media erupted. Clips of Crockett's calm takedown hit Twitter within seconds. She's schooling her on live TV. This is composure. This is leadership. Memes sprouted almost instantly. Conway mid-shout on one side, Crockett serene on the other, captions reading, "Louder doesn't mean right." Crockett wasn't done. She leaned in slightly, her voice still even, but her words carried an edge now, not of anger, but of undeniable authority. You say accountability matters. I agree. It's why I've spent my career holding power to account. Sometimes power that looks like you, sometimes power that looks like me. But accountability isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing the weight of your words, knowing when to listen, and knowing when to stop. The room was so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the studio equipment. Conway sat back, lips pressed tight, perhaps preparing to strike again, but there was nothing to strike at. Crockett hadn't just parried, she had removed the ground. Entirely! She closed with something unexpected, something that didn't feel like an attack at all. Here's what I know. People are tired. They're tired of noise. They're tired of politics as a shouting match. They want to know someone is listening. And I promise you, I will always listen, even to you. That was it. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just composure, clarity, and a reminder that power doesn't always need to be loud to be felt. The anchors finally exhaled. One leaned back, almost smiling. Another tapped their pen, clearly aware they'd just witnessed something that would live far beyond this segment. By the time she finished, Conway wasn't the only one silent. The entire panel froze. The segment ended, but the story was just beginning. Even before the credits rolled, the internet was already moving at a speed the studio couldn't match. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's quiet dismantling of Conway were all over Twitter. Some had captions as simple as "this," while others spelled it out, "This is how you handle bullies." The edits were quick, sharp, and impossible to scroll past. TikTok took it further. Snappy cuts with music, freeze frames on Conway's raised voice, then a slow zoom on Crockett's steady eyes. YouTube commentary channels raced to upload reaction videos, titles screaming, "Conway meets her match," and "The calm that broke the internet." The praise was not just about what Crockett said, it was about how she said it. People saw in her a kind of quiet strength that's rare in politics, a poise that felt almost cinematic. Tweets poured in, "This is leadership." She didn't just clap back. She educated. Watching this felt like a breath of fresh air. Journalists picked it up next. Headlines began to appear on major outlets before the night was over. Commentators analyzed every line, some marveling at the contrast between the two women. It wasn't just a debate, one article read. It was a masterclass in composure. Cable news shows replayed the clip, some with admiration, some with grudging respect. Even Conway's usual allies, while defending her politics, admitted on air that the moment belonged to Crockett. Celebrities joined in. A well-known actor tweeted, "Some people scream to be heard. Others make silence louder. Crockett just proved which works." Activists, athletes, and community leaders shared the video, tagging friends and followers. It was no longer just a political moment. It was becoming cultural. For many, especially those who rarely saw themselves represented in these rooms, it meant something more. It wasn't just a sharp retort on live TV. It was validation. Crockett's calm, deliberate tone gave dignity a face, and for audiences who had been talked over, dismissed, or underestimated, the clip felt personal. It wasn't about winning a point. It was about reclaiming space. By morning, the ripple had become a wave. Think pieces appeared online, dissecting why Crockett's delivery resonated. Some focused on gender dynamics, others on race, others on generational style. But the theme was the same. She didn't just defend herself, she defended dignity. Memes took over Instagram. Fan edits showed her speaking while the screen filled with words like respect, power, grace. Facebook groups shared the video with captions like, "This is how you lead without shouting." And TikTok's algorithm made sure that even people who didn't follow politics were suddenly watching 2 minutes of tension turn into triumph. And yet, the moment wasn't just about praise. It sparked conversations, heated ones. Supporters hailed it as overdue proof that substance could outshine noise. Critics bristled, saying it was theater, not policy. But regardless of the angle, everyone was talking about it. The show's producers couldn't keep up with the requests for clips. Their ratings jumped overnight. Emails flooded in, asking for transcripts, for replay times. It was rare for a single panel discussion to break through the chaos of daily news. But this one had done more than that. It had cut across divides, giving people something to rally around. And just when the internet thought it was over, something even bigger happened. In the days that followed, the noise faded, but the meaning grew louder. What viewers witnessed on that stage wasn't just a political exchange, it was a reminder of what real strength looks like. Strength isn't volume, it's control. It's the ability to remain unshaken while someone else tries to set the room on fire. Conway brought the storm. Crockett became the stillness that broke it. And that difference made all the impact. For so many watching, especially those who've felt dismissed or talked over, this moment was deeply personal. It wasn't only about politics, it was about dignity. People saw themselves in that chair, with the cameras glaring, with a voice trying to drown them out. And they saw proof that calm courage doesn't just survive pressure, it thrives under it. Crockett didn't need to match Conway's decibels. She proved that control commands more attention than chaos ever could. This was a universal lesson dressed as a television segment. For every student whose hand was ignored, for every immigrant who was told to stay quiet, for every woman who was interrupted mid-sentence, this clip became a kind of validation. It said, "Your voice doesn't need to be the loudest to be heard. Your presence, your clarity, and your preparation are more powerful than anyone's attempt to diminish them." It also reminded the world that representation matters. Crockett's serenity, composure carried the weight of history and community, but it wasn't heavy. It was sharp, clear, and intentional. When she spoke, she wasn't just defending herself. She was defending the idea that respect is not optional. And in that moment, it felt like more than a rebuttal. It felt like a promise. Even journalists who thrive on confrontation couldn't ignore the takeaway. Debates aren't just won by facts or fire. They're won by the person who controls the room. Conway's history of sharp tactics had met something she couldn't overpower, a quiet strength that didn't just hold its ground but shifted it. And maybe that's why the moment traveled so far. It wasn't a victory for one person, it was a blueprint. It showed that leadership can look like stillness, that confidence can live in measured words, and that truth often sounds like the calmest voice in the room. By the week's end, the frenzy of clips and commentary slowed, but the moral stayed with people. And somewhere, in offices, classrooms, and living rooms, someone was remembering that night, not for the shouting, but for the pause that followed it. Because sometimes the most unforgettable sound is the one that comes when the noise finally stops. It began with chaos, a familiar face, a raised voice, the kind of TV clash that people expect to flare and fade. But this time, something different happened. Kellyanne Conway came in swinging, her words sharp, her tone relentless, expecting the room to bend. What she didn't expect was silence used as a weapon. Crockett didn't fight for air. She owned it. With each measured word, she turned the EQ noise into background static. And when her moment came, it landed with precision. That's why people couldn't look away. The tension wasn't just about two women at a table. It was about something bigger. It was about voice versus volume, respect versus spectacle, the power of composure against the temptation of chaos. And in that clash, the one who stayed grounded stood tallest. So here's the takeaway. Next time someone tries to shout you down, remember this moment. Remember that the loudest person isn't always the strongest, and calm doesn't mean weak. It means prepared. Whether it's in a meeting, at a family table, or in the public square, strength can be quiet, and quiet can be unforgettable. And if this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Post it. Talk about it. Let it travel like it did that night, turning a single exchange into a shared lesson.